the anatomy of a fallout, deflection, and the weaponization of grief. Few experiences reshape a relationship more profoundly than personal loss. Whether the loss involves a career setback, the end of a friendship, financial hardship, or the heartbreak of a pregnancy loss, grief has a way of exposing the strongest and weakest parts of human character. In healthy circumstances, grief can become a source of mutual support and deeper understanding. In unhealthy circumstances, however, grief may become entangled with blame, resentment, defensiveness, and public image management. This article examines a hypothetical public fallout in which a well-known figure faces allegations of misconduct and responds by redirecting responsibility toward a spouse. Rather than focusing on any real individual, this analysis explores broader psychological and social themes: deflection, accountability avoidance, victim blaming, public sympathy, media narratives, and the ethical challenges that arise when private grief becomes public discourse. The purpose is not to determine guilt or innocence in any specific case. Instead, it is to understand how people react when relationships fracture under pressure and how grief can sometimes be transformed into a rhetorical tool rather than a shared human experience. The collision between crisis and public image. Public figures often live in two worlds simultaneously. The first world is private. It consists of family dinners, difficult conversations, personal fears, and emotional struggles that remain unseen by audiences. The second world is public. Here, every statement becomes a headline, every silence becomes a rumor, and every perceived mistake becomes part of a larger narrative. When controversy emerges, these worlds collide. The challenge for many individuals is that reputation suddenly becomes intertwined with accountability. Rather than confronting criticism directly, some people may instinctively seek explanations that preserve their self-image. Psychologists have long observed that human beings possess a strong desire to view themselves positively. When evidence threatens that self-concept, defensive mechanisms often emerge. One of the most common mechanisms is deflection. Deflection occurs when attention is redirected away from one's own behavior and toward another factor. Sometimes the factor is external circumstances. Sometimes it is society. Sometimes it is another person. The greater the threat to reputation, the stronger the temptation to shift focus elsewhere. Understanding deflection. Deflection is not always intentional manipulation. In many cases, individuals genuinely convince themselves that they are less responsible than they actually are. This process can occur because acknowledging wrongdoing is emotionally painful. Consider a hypothetical scenario. A person faces criticism for a harmful decision. Rather than confronting their role directly, they begin focusing on surrounding circumstances: stress at work, financial pressure, emotional exhaustion, relationship problems, family difficulties. While these factors may be real, they do not necessarily eliminate personal responsibility. The distinction is important. Explaining behavior is not the same as excusing behavior. Healthy accountability allows room for both truths. I was struggling, and I am still responsible for my actions. Deflection becomes problematic when explanation evolves into blame. The psychology of blame. Blame often serves a psychological purpose. It reduces discomfort. When people feel shame, guilt, embarrassment, or fear, assigning responsibility elsewhere can provide temporary emotional relief. Researchers sometimes refer to this as self-serving bias. Self-serving bias encourages individuals to attribute successes to themselves, attribute failures to external causes. In everyday life, this pattern appears constantly. A student attributes a high grade to intelligence, but a poor grade to an unfair test. An employee credits success to talent, but attributes failure to difficult circumstances. Within relationships, however, the consequences can be far more severe. When blame becomes habitual, trust begins to erode. Partners may feel unheard. Victims may feel invalidated. Communication becomes increasingly adversarial. The relationship gradually transforms from a partnership into a contest over responsibility. Grief as a vulnerable human experience. Grief occupies a unique place in human psychology. Unlike many emotions, grief often strips away ordinary defenses. People experiencing loss frequently feel vulnerable, exhausted, confused, isolated, emotionally overwhelmed. This vulnerability is precisely why grief deserves special ethical consideration. When someone mourns a loss, they are often navigating one of the most fragile periods of their life. Compassion becomes essential. Support becomes essential. Patience becomes essential. Because grief affects cognition, memory, and emotional regulation, individuals may struggle to process events clearly. The goal should rarely be assigning blame. Instead, the goal should be healing. Unfortunately, public controversies do not always leave room for healing. They often create incentives for narrative warfare, and grief can become a powerful narrative tool. The weaponization of grief. The phrase weaponization of grief refers to situations in which loss is used strategically rather than compassionately. This can occur in many forms. A person might invoke tragedy to avoid accountability. A public figure might highlight personal suffering to redirect attention from criticism. Supporters might frame all scrutiny as cruelty because the individual has experienced hardship. In these cases, grief becomes more than an emotional reality. It becomes an argumentative shield. The ethical problem is not acknowledging suffering. The ethical problem is using suffering to silence legitimate discussion. A person can experience genuine pain while still being responsible for harmful actions. These truths are not mutually exclusive. Indeed, mature accountability often requires holding both truths simultaneously. Public sympathy and narrative power. Human beings naturally empathize with suffering. Stories involving grief often generate immediate emotional responses. This response is not weakness, it is part of our social wiring. Compassion helps communities survive. However, compassion can sometimes influence judgment. When audiences encounter competing narratives, sympathy may determine which narrative receives greater acceptance. This creates a strategic incentive. If one side successfully positions itself as the primary victim, public opinion may shift dramatically. As a result, controversies sometimes evolve into contests over victimhood rather than discussions of facts. The most emotionally compelling story frequently becomes the most influential story. Whether it is the most accurate story is another question entirely. Accountability versus self-protection. Perhaps the most important distinction in any public fallout is the difference between accountability and self-protection. Self-protection asks, how do I minimize damage? Accountability asks, what is my responsibility? The answers often lead in different directions. Self-protection may encourage excuses, rationalizations, blame shifting, selective storytelling. Accountability may require admission, apology, reflection, change. The latter is far more difficult, yet it is also far more likely to rebuild trust over time. Conclusion: the anatomy of a fallout is rarely simple. Conflict, grief, reputation, shame, and public perception interact in complicated ways. When controversy intersects with personal loss, emotions intensify and narratives become more powerful. The central lesson of this hypothetical analysis is that grief should never be treated as a weapon, a shield, or a substitute for accountability. Loss deserves compassion. Responsibility deserves honesty. Public audiences deserve caution before accepting emotionally charged narratives at face value. Most importantly, healing becomes possible only when individuals resist the temptation to transform suffering into blame and instead confront difficult truths with humility, empathy, and integrity. The mechanics of public fallout, when private conflict becomes public property. One of the defining characteristics of modern controversies is the speed with which private disputes become public conversations. A disagreement that once might have remained confined to a household can now become a topic of discussion among thousands or even millions of people. Social media platforms, online communities, podcasts, reaction channels, and digital news outlets create an environment where personal conflicts are transformed into public narratives. The consequences are significant. Once a conflict enters the public sphere, it no longer belongs entirely to the individuals involved. audiences begin interpreting events through their own experiences, biases, and assumptions. Every statement becomes evidence. Every omission becomes suspicious. And every emotional expression becomes subject to analysis. This environment creates immense pressure. People facing criticism often feel compelled to respond immediately. They may believe silence will be interpreted as guilt. They may fear losing public support. They may worry about long-term damage to their reputation. Under these conditions, communication often becomes reactive rather than thoughtful. Instead of asking, "What is true?" people begin asking, "What will people think?" The difference between those two questions can determine the entire course of a controversy. The search for a villain. Human beings naturally gravitate towards simple stories. Complex situations are difficult to process. They require patience, uncertainty, and nuance. Simple stories require only heroes and villains. When a public fallout occurs, audiences frequently search for a central antagonist. Questions emerge almost immediately. Who caused the problem? Who deserves sympathy? Who should be blamed? Who is telling the truth? Unfortunately, reality rarely provides clear answers. Relationships are complex systems composed of communication patterns, emotional histories, external pressures, personal insecurities, and countless private experiences. Reducing such complexity to a single villain often obscures important truths. Nevertheless, public narratives frequently move in that direction because simplicity is easier to consume than ambiguity. The search for a villain can distort public understanding. People may ignore contradictory evidence. They may overlook contextual factors. They may selectively interpret information to fit an existing conclusion. This tendency is not limited to audiences. Individuals involved in the conflict may also adopt simplified narratives to protect themselves from emotional discomfort. The role of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is one of the most powerful forces in public discourse. Once people form an initial impression, they often seek information that confirms their existing beliefs while dismissing information that challenges them. Imagine two observers witnessing the same controversy. The first observer already believes the accused individual is dishonest. The second observer already believes the accused individual is trustworthy. Both observers may review the exact same evidence, yet they may arrive at completely different conclusions. This phenomenon occurs because human beings do not process information in a purely objective manner. We interpret information through mental frameworks that shape our perceptions. Confirmation bias becomes especially influential when emotions are involved. The stronger the emotional investment, the stronger the bias. As a result, public controversies often generate polarized communities that interpret identical events in dramatically different ways. Reputation management versus truth-seeking. In many public controversies, the goals of reputation management and truth-seeking begin to diverge. Truth-seeking involves careful examination of facts, uncertainties, and context. Reputation management focuses on preserving public perception. These objectives sometimes overlap. They often do not. Truth-seeking welcomes complexity. Reputation management prefers clarity. Truth-seeking tolerates ambiguity. Reputation management seeks certainty. Truth-seeking acknowledges mistakes. Reputation management frequently minimizes them. When individuals prioritize image preservation above all else, communication may become increasingly strategic. Statements are crafted not necessarily to illuminate reality, but to influence perception. This does not automatically imply dishonesty. However, it can create an environment where public understanding becomes secondary to public relations. The result is confusion. Audiences struggle to distinguish between genuine accountability and carefully constructed messaging. The emotional economics of sympathy. Sympathy possesses social value. It attracts support. It encourages forgiveness. It influences public opinion. This reality creates what some commentators describe as the emotional economics of controversy. In this framework, emotional narratives function almost like currency. The more compelling the story, the greater the public response. Stories involving hardship often generate particularly strong reactions. Audiences identify with suffering. They empathize with vulnerability. They recognize pain. This capacity for empathy is deeply human and often admirable. Yet sympathy can sometimes influence judgment in unexpected ways. People may become reluctant to evaluate behavior critically if doing so feels insensitive. They may fear appearing cruel. They may hesitate to ask difficult questions. As a result, emotional narratives can occasionally overshadow factual analysis. The challenge is maintaining both compassion and critical thinking simultaneously. Neither should eliminate the other. Accountability as a process. Many people imagine accountability as a single moment, a confession, an apology, a public statement. In reality, accountability is usually a process. It unfolds over time. It involves repeated decisions rather than isolated gestures. Meaningful accountability often includes several elements. Acknowledgement. The individual recognizes their role in the situation. Ownership responsibility is accepted without excessive qualification. Repair efforts are made to address harm where possible. Reflection. The person examines underlying causes. Change behavioral adjustments demonstrate growth. Without these elements, accountability risks becoming symbolic rather than substantive. Words alone rarely restore trust. Trust is rebuilt through consistent action. The burden of public scrutiny. Public scrutiny affects everyone differently. Some individuals become defensive, others withdraw, some attempt to explain themselves repeatedly, others choose silence. None of these responses automatically indicate guilt or innocence. They simply reflect different coping mechanisms. Being observed by large audiences creates unique psychological challenges. Every statement can be dissected. Every mistake can be amplified. Every emotional reaction can become content. Researchers studying public criticism often note that intense scrutiny may increase stress, anxiety, and feelings of isolation. These pressures do not excuse harmful conduct. However, they help explain why public controversies often become emotionally volatile. People under intense pressure may communicate poorly. They may become reactive. They may prioritize short-term survival over long-term resolution. Understanding these dynamics does not require abandoning accountability. It simply requires recognizing the humanity involved. The difference between explanation and excuse. One of the most misunderstood distinctions in public discourse is the difference between explanation and excuse. An explanation answers, "Why did this happen?" An excuse attempts to answer, "Why should I not be responsible?" These are fundamentally different questions. A person may provide context without avoiding accountability. Likewise, a person may use context strategically to diminish accountability. The challenge lies in distinguishing between the two. Healthy explanations increase understanding. Unhealthy excuses reduce responsibility. The distinction often becomes visible through language. People focused on accountability tend to discuss their own actions. People focused on excuses frequently emphasize external factors. The more responsibility shifts outward, the more likely accountability is being replaced by self-protection. Healing after conflict. Not every fallout ends in permanent division. Some relationships survive profound crises, others do not. Regardless of outcome, healing requires confronting reality honestly. Denial may provide temporary relief. Avoidance may delay discomfort. But unresolved conflicts rarely disappear on their own. Healing often begins with difficult conversations. Conversations involving vulnerability. Conversations involving regret. Conversations involving uncomfortable truths. These discussions are rarely easy. They challenge pride. They expose insecurity. They require courage. Yet they also create opportunities for growth. Individuals who engage honestly with their failures frequently emerge with deeper self-awareness. Relationships that survive adversity often do so because participants choose honesty over image management. The process is painful, but pain and growth frequently coexist. The ethics of public judgment. Audiences also bear responsibilities. Public observers are not merely passive consumers of information. They participate in shaping narratives. This influence carries ethical implications. When evaluating controversies, audiences should consider several questions. What evidence exists? What remains unknown? Are assumptions being presented as facts? Are emotional reactions replacing critical analysis? Is empathy being extended fairly? Responsible judgment requires humility. Few outsiders possess complete information. Most public controversies involve facts that remain private. Recognizing these limitations can prevent premature conclusions. It can also encourage more thoughtful discussion. Lessons from public fallout. The most enduring lessons from public controversies rarely concern specific individuals. Instead, they reveal broader truths about human behavior. They show how fear influences decision-making. They reveal the power of shame. They demonstrate the appeal of simple narratives. They expose the tension between image and integrity. Most importantly, they highlight the importance of accountability. Mistakes are universal. Failure is universal. Conflict is universal. What distinguishes individuals is often not whether they make mistakes, but how they respond afterward. The path of deflection may offer temporary protection. The path of accountability offers the possibility of genuine growth. That distinction lies at the heart of nearly every public fallout: narrative, memory, and the long shadow of controversy. The stories people tell themselves. Every major conflict produces multiple stories. There is the story told publicly. There is the story told privately. There is the story told to friends. There is the story told to critics. And perhaps most importantly, there is the story people tell themselves. Human beings are natural storytellers. We construct narratives to make sense of events, emotions, and experiences. These narratives help create order from chaos. When painful events occur, people often revise their internal stories in ways that protect their sense of identity. A person who sees themselves as caring may struggle to accept evidence that they caused harm. A person who views themselves as responsible may find it difficult to acknowledge negligence. A person who believes they are a victim may overlook ways they contributed to conflict. These tendencies are not necessarily malicious. They are part of the human effort to preserve psychological stability. However, self-protective narratives can become obstacles to growth when they prevent honest self-examination. Growth requires confronting facts that challenge preferred versions of ourselves. That process is uncomfortable, yet it is often essential. Memory and reconstruction. Contrary to popular belief, memory does not function like a video recording. Memories are reconstructed each time they are recalled. This reconstruction process means that memories can evolve over time. Details fade, interpretations change, emotions influence recollection. Two people may sincerely remember the same event differently. Neither individual may be intentionally deceptive. Instead, each person is viewing the past through a distinct emotional lens. This reality complicates many conflicts. Participants often assume their memories represent objective truth. When another person remembers events differently, accusations of dishonesty may emerge. In reality, both individuals may genuinely believe their versions. Understanding this possibility encourages humility. It reminds us that certainty is not always synonymous with accuracy. Public narratives and collective memory. Just as individuals create narratives, communities do as well. Public audiences gradually develop collective memories about controversies. These memories often become simplified over time. Complex events are reduced to brief summaries. Nuance disappears. Context fades. What remains is a dominant narrative. The problem is that dominant narratives are not always complete. A controversy involving dozens of factors may eventually be remembered through a single headline. Years later, many people may recall only the simplified version. This process influences reputations long after the original events have ended. For public figures, collective memory can become a powerful force. Past mistakes may follow them indefinitely. Past achievements may be forgotten. Past controversies may become defining characteristics. The challenge lies in balancing accountability with fairness. People should not be permanently imprisoned by the worst moments of their lives. At the same time, accountability requires acknowledging harm rather than erasing it. Finding that balance remains one of society's most difficult tasks. The attraction of moral certainty. One reason controversies become polarized is that moral certainty feels satisfying. Ambiguity is uncomfortable. Uncertainty is frustrating. Complexity demands effort. Moral certainty offers simplicity. It provides clear answers. It eliminates doubt. Yet certainty can sometimes exceed available evidence. When this happens, discussions become less about understanding and more about defending predetermined conclusions. People begin treating uncertainty as weakness. Questions become viewed as disloyalty. Nuance becomes mistaken for indecision. Healthy discourse requires resisting this temptation. Not every question has immediate answers. Not every conflict contains a perfect hero and a perfect villain. Not every disagreement can be reduced to a simple moral equation. Recognizing complexity does not weaken accountability. It strengthens understanding. Shame and defensive behavior. Few emotions influence human behavior more powerfully than shame. Guilt focuses on actions. Shame focuses on identity. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, there is something wrong with me. This distinction matters. Research suggests that guilt often motivates repair and accountability. Shame frequently motivates defensiveness. When people feel deeply ashamed, they may deny wrongdoing, shift blame, minimize consequences, attack critics, rewrite events. These behaviors serve an emotional purpose. They protect the individual from overwhelming psychological distress. Unfortunately, they also make reconciliation more difficult. Healing generally requires moving beyond defensive reactions and toward honest reflection. That transition can take time. In some cases, it never fully occurs. The cost of living through a narrative. One of the hidden consequences of public controversy is the pressure to remain consistent with a chosen narrative. Once a person publicly commits to a particular story, changing that story becomes difficult. Admitting mistakes may appear contradictory. Acknowledging new information may seem like weakness. As a result, individuals sometimes become trapped by their own narratives. They continue defending positions long after private doubts emerge. The longer this continues, the harder it becomes to reverse course. Psychologists refer to a related phenomenon as commitment escalation. People invest so heavily in a position that abandoning it feels more painful than maintaining it. This dynamic appears in politics, business, relationships, and public controversies alike. The result is often prolonged conflict, not because resolution is impossible, but because changing course feels emotionally expensive. Forgiveness and misunderstanding. Forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood concepts in public discourse. Some people view forgiveness as forgetting. Others view it as excusing behavior. Neither definition is entirely accurate. Forgiveness does not erase consequences. It does not require denying harm. It does not necessarily restore trust. Instead, forgiveness often involves releasing the desire for perpetual punishment. This distinction matters. A person can forgive while maintaining boundaries. A person can forgive while remaining cautious. A person can forgive while remembering what occurred. Public audiences frequently struggle with this idea because modern discussions often frame issues in absolute terms. Either someone is condemned forever, or they are completely absolved. Real life rarely functions that way. Human relationships are more complicated. Redemption and its challenges. Most societies claim to believe in redemption, yet redemption becomes complicated when tested. People often support the concept in theory. In practice, reactions vary significantly. Questions emerge. How much accountability is enough? How much time must pass? What actions demonstrate genuine change? Who decides whether redemption has occurred? There are no universal answers. Every situation differs. However, meaningful redemption generally requires more than public statements. It requires sustained evidence of growth. It requires behavioral consistency. It requires humility. Perhaps most importantly, redemption cannot be demanded. It must be earned. Even then, acceptance remains uncertain. The audience's emotional investment. Many observers become emotionally invested in public conflicts. This investment often stems from identification. People see aspects of their own experiences reflected in the controversy. Someone who experienced betrayal may identify with one side. Someone who experienced false accusations may identify with another. These personal connections influence interpretation. The controversy becomes more than an external event. It becomes a symbolic representation of personal values, fears, and experiences. This emotional investment explains why discussions can become intensely passionate. People are not merely debating facts. They are defending deeply held beliefs about justice, loyalty, accountability, and trust. Recognizing this dynamic can improve conversations. It reminds participants that emotions often shape perspectives more than they realize. The long-term impact of conflict. While public attention often focuses on immediate events, the most significant consequences frequently emerge later. Trust may take years to rebuild. Relationships may evolve permanently. Personal identities may shift. Lessons may continue influencing decisions long after public interest fades. Some individuals emerge from conflict with greater self-awareness. Others become more guarded. Some strengthen relationships. Others lose them. The outcomes vary. What remains consistent is that major conflicts rarely leave people unchanged. Adversity acts as a catalyst. It reveals strengths. It exposes weaknesses. It forces decisions. And those decisions shape the future. The importance of honest reflection. Reflection differs from rumination. Rumination repeatedly revisits pain without resolution. Reflection seeks understanding. Healthy reflection asks difficult questions. What happened? What role did I play? What can I learn? How can I improve? These questions require courage because they challenge self-protective narratives, yet they also create opportunities for growth. Individuals who engage honestly with these questions often develop greater emotional maturity. They become more aware of patterns. They become more capable of accountability. They become better equipped to navigate future challenges. Reflection does not guarantee transformation, but transformation rarely occurs without reflection. Beyond the fallout. Eventually, every controversy reaches a turning point. Public attention shifts. New stories emerge. The headlines fade. The online debates diminish. Yet life continues. The individuals involved must still live with the consequences. They must still navigate relationships. They must still confront personal choices. This reality highlights an important truth. Public controversies may appear dramatic from the outside, but at their core, they often involve ordinary human struggles. Fear, pride, shame, loss, love, accountability, hope. These themes transcend any single event. They connect individual stories to broader human experiences. And perhaps that is why public fallouts capture attention so powerfully. They remind us of ourselves, not because the circumstances are identical, but because the emotions are familiar. The challenge is learning from these stories without becoming consumed by them, to seek understanding rather than certainty, to pursue accountability without abandoning compassion, to recognize complexity without surrendering moral judgment, and to remember that behind every controversy are human beings navigating imperfect circumstances in an imperfect world. Accountability, recovery, and the future beyond crisis. The morning after the storm. Every major conflict has two phases. The first phase is the crisis itself. The second phase is what happens afterward. Most public attention focuses on the crisis. Headlines, commentary, emotional reactions, and intense discussions dominate the conversation, yet the period after the storm often proves more important than the storm itself. When the noise begins to fade, individuals are left alone with reality. The cameras move on. The public becomes distracted by new stories. The excitement disappears. What remains are the consequences. Relationships still require repair. Trust still requires rebuilding. Personal growth still requires effort. The absence of public attention does not eliminate private challenges. In many ways, the hardest work begins after the audience leaves. Recovery is rarely dramatic. It is usually quiet. It happens through ordinary decisions made consistently over long periods of time. The difference between regret and responsibility. Regret and responsibility are often confused. Regret is emotional. Responsibility is behavioral. A person may regret consequences without accepting responsibility for actions. Likewise, a person may accept responsibility even while struggling emotionally with what occurred. This distinction matters because genuine accountability requires more than feeling bad. It requires action. Many people experience regret because circumstances became difficult. Fewer people engage in the deeper work of examining how their own decisions contributed to those circumstances. Responsibility asks uncomfortable questions. What choices led here? What warning signs were ignored? What patterns need to change? How can future harm be prevented? These questions move beyond emotion and toward growth. Without responsibility, regret often becomes temporary. With responsibility, regret can become transformative. The role of courage in self-examination. Self-examination is often portrayed as an intellectual exercise. In reality, it is an act of courage. Looking honestly at one's own failures can be deeply uncomfortable. People naturally prefer information that supports a positive self-image. Criticism challenges that image. Mistakes challenge that image. Consequences challenge that image. Yet growth frequently requires confronting these challenges directly. Courage is not the absence of discomfort. Courage is the willingness to remain engaged despite discomfort. This principle applies to individuals, relationships, organizations, and entire communities. The path toward improvement often begins with a simple admission. There are things I need to understand about myself. That admission may appear small. In practice, it can be life-changing. Trust as a fragile resource. Trust is one of the most valuable resources in human relationships. Unlike money or material possessions, trust cannot be replaced quickly. It develops gradually. It grows through consistency. It depends upon reliability. Once damaged, rebuilding trust becomes extraordinarily difficult. This difficulty exists because trust involves prediction. When we trust someone, we believe we can reasonably predict their behavior. A betrayal disrupts that confidence. The injured person begins questioning assumptions that once felt secure. Can promises be believed? Can explanations be trusted? Can future commitments be relied upon? These questions do not disappear simply because an apology is offered. Trust requires evidence. It requires time. It requires patience. And it requires repeated demonstrations of change. Public perception versus private reality. One of the most fascinating aspects of modern controversies is the difference between public perception and private reality. Audiences often assume they understand far more than they actually do. This is understandable. People receive information through interviews, social media posts, articles, videos, and public statements. The volume of information can create an illusion of complete understanding. Yet most personal relationships contain countless private experiences that remain invisible. Outsiders rarely possess the full picture. This reality encourages caution. Public perception can influence reputations dramatically. However, perception should not automatically be mistaken for comprehensive knowledge. The distinction is important because certainty often exceeds available evidence. Wise observers remain aware of what they do not know. Learning from failure. Failure has educational value. This does not mean failure is desirable. Painful experiences can cause genuine harm. Nevertheless, adversity often reveals lessons that success conceals. Failure exposes weaknesses. It identifies blind spots. It reveals habits and assumptions that previously went unnoticed. Individuals who approach failure constructively often ask, "What can this teach me? What patterns contributed to this outcome? What changes would produce better results?" These questions transform failure into information. The experience remains difficult, but it also becomes useful. Growth frequently emerges from this process. The influence of time. Time changes perspectives. Events that once seemed overwhelming may later appear manageable. Conflicts that felt impossible to resolve may become easier to understand. Emotions that once dominated decision-making may gradually lose intensity. This transformation does not occur because time magically solves problems. Rather, time creates distance. Distance allows reflection. Reflection allows insight. Insight creates opportunities for growth. Many individuals discover that their understanding of a conflict evolves significantly months or years after it occurred. New information emerges, emotions settle, patterns become visible, lessons become clearer. Time does not guarantee wisdom, but it often creates conditions in which wisdom becomes more accessible. Rebuilding identity after crisis. Major conflicts frequently disrupt personal identity. People begin questioning assumptions about themselves. Who am I? What kind of person do I want to become? What values matter most? These questions become especially important after significant setbacks. Identity reconstruction involves making choices. Some individuals become defined by their worst moments. Others learn from those moments while refusing to be permanently limited by them. The difference often lies in perspective. A mistake can become a permanent label, or it can become a chapter within a larger story. Neither option changes the past, but each option influences the future. Accountability and compassion. Public discussions sometimes treat accountability and compassion as opposing forces. They are not. Accountability without compassion can become cruelty. Compassion without accountability can become enablement. Healthy responses require both. Compassion recognizes human imperfection. Accountability recognizes human responsibility. Together, they create a balanced framework for evaluating difficult situations. This balance is challenging. People often gravitate toward extremes. Some prioritize punishment above all else. Others prioritize forgiveness above all else. The most constructive approaches typically avoid both extremes. They acknowledge harm while recognizing humanity. They encourage growth while maintaining standards. They seek understanding without abandoning responsibility. The long shadow of controversy. Even after a controversy fades from public attention, its effects often remain. Relationships may change permanently, career opportunities may shift, personal priorities may evolve. The experience becomes part of an individual's history. This long shadow can be difficult, yet it can also provide perspective. Many people later recognize that their most difficult experiences shaped their greatest lessons. The pain was real, the consequences were real, but so was the growth. Adversity often forces choices that comfort never demands. Those choices influence character, and character influences the future. Moving forward. Moving forward does not mean forgetting. It does not mean pretending nothing happened. It does not mean erasing consequences. Instead, moving forward means integrating experiences into a broader understanding of life. The past becomes a teacher rather than a prison. Lessons become tools rather than burdens. Mistakes become sources of insight rather than sources of endless shame. This process takes time. It requires patience, it requires honesty, and it requires effort. Yet it remains possible. Human beings possess remarkable capacities for adaptation, learning, and growth. History repeatedly demonstrates this truth. Final reflections. The anatomy of any fallout is ultimately a story about people. People confronting pressure, people responding to criticism, people struggling with loss, people navigating accountability, people searching for meaning. The details vary from case to case. The underlying themes remain remarkably consistent. Fear influences decisions, pride shapes narratives, shame encourages defensiveness, compassion offers healing, accountability creates opportunities for growth. The challenge is recognizing these forces while maintaining balance, to avoid simplistic conclusions, to resist the temptation of certainty when uncertainty remains, to acknowledge complexity without abandoning moral judgment, and to remember that every public controversy involves human beings whose lives continue long after public attention disappears. In the end, the most important question is rarely who won the narrative battle. The more important question is what was learned, because narratives shape reputations, but lessons shape futures. Hello guys, I am Sabrina. To you, welcome back to my channel. Please subscribe the channel and press bell icon for latest news updates.